Okay, hi everyone. Today I'm joined by Graham Harman and Todd McGowan. Graham Harman is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Southern California Institute of Architecture and the author of numerous books, including Object-Oriented Ontology, Tool Being, Art and Objects, and Immaterialism. Todd McGowan teaches film and critical theory at the University of Vermont and is the author of many books, including Emancipation After Hegel, Capitalism and Desire, and Universality and Identity. Now, in the past, these two individuals have had certain disagreements over their respective ontologies, and they're here to discuss these disagreements along with whatever agreements they may have. Now, Graham Harman is, of course, one of the main proponents and one of the creators of object-oriented ontology, while Todd McGowan is the proponent of his own ontology of contradiction. So the structure of this conversation is very simple, very flexible. We'll begin with introductory statements. Then we got some open discussion. Then we'll maybe do some questions posed by myself and then closing statements. So thank you both for being here. I'm very excited to see how this discussion goes. And if you don't mind, Dr. Harman, why don't you begin with your opening statement?
Sure. Is there a feedback problem still? If so, maybe you should both mute while I'm okay.
It sounds fine to me.
Okay. All right. Well, Trey mentioned that Todd and I have had our disagreements. Yes, but very respectful disagreements. And this is my first time meeting Todd, by the way, though I've seen him on video many times and read his work. But I have, of course, a high regard for Hegel. Who couldn't? He's at least a top 5 figure in the history of Western philosophy. Can't put him any lower than that. I'd say maybe 4, 3. It's arguable. And also, I don't know to what extent Todd identifies with the Ljubljana school, but he's pretty closely associated with it. And that's another group for which I have a high regard. I've had quite a few dealings with Slavoj Žižek, some with Russell Sperlia. So there's not any sort of hostility in this disagreement. It's not like me and Ray Brassier's people, where it's really a feud. Brassier, Wolfendale, those people. This is a cordial series of disagreements. So I wanted to emphasize that right at the top. Now, object-oriented ontology, which is OOO pronounced triple O, at least I pronounce it that way. Sorry, a bit of a cult. Defends something like the thing in itself, or like Heideggerian withdrawn being. And in that respect, it seems to directly run counter to everything that Hegel stands for. So from a Hegelian standpoint, triple O might look like something that's always already been overcome by Hegel's critique of the thing in itself. And so I realized that from a Hegelian standpoint, we look like we're a revival, a neo of something that's already been disposed of. There's a funny thing about Kant, though, which is that everyone recognizes Kant's greatness, but people generally don't like the part about the thing in itself. That's the part that people tend to look at as left in a ditch by the side of the road, and rightly so. Yet the thing in itself was so central to Kant's position. It's what allowed him to critique dogmatism, even though it's sometimes treated as a residue of dogmatism. Without the thing in itself, Kant cannot critique dogmatic metaphysics, right? Because if the human has access to the world directly, then dogmatism is still okay. And so we have to at least accept the fact that the thing in itself was very important in Kant's own eyes. It's not something he thought could be gotten rid of. And in this sense, the transcendental position, if we want to call it that, the idea that we only have access to a finite chunk of the universe and everything else is out there beyond us, other than the Hegelian line of succession, meaning Hegel himself, the Frankfurt School, Zizek, maybe Badiou, arguably some others in that zone, the transcendental position is really the bread and butter of what we call continental philosophy today. And I think this is my explanation for why Triple O has made almost no progress in what we call continental philosophy, the types of people who meet at the SPEP conference. You're not going to find much of anyone doing Triple O stuff there. It's mostly in other disciplines. The Triple O is of interest. It's a little bit in analytic philosophy, still small, but it's primarily an interdisciplinary discourse right now, kind of like Zizek started himself, ironically. So there are 2 key ways that triple O differs from Kant, and I want to put those on the table now. The key one is that, first of all, objects are noumena for each other as well in triple O. For Kant, the noumena are this special, tragic burden of human finitude that the human intellect, human thought wants to get something, but it can't get it. For OOO, this is a problem that haunts the realm of causality as well. That's really one of the two original parts of OOO, the fact that object-object relations are back on the table for the first time in a way that they haven't been since Leibniz, and with the exception of Whitehead, maybe Bruno Latour, maybe that'll come up later. The other thing that's key to OOO is the object quality distinction. You get a bit of this in Aristotle with the difference between substance and quality or substance and accident, but Husserl is unique in transferring this to the phenomenal realm, where empiricism, and not just empiricism, but a lot of people after Hume, think of objects in terms of bundles of qualities. And Kant gets close to seeing through this, but not quite, because Kant, along with the noumena, has what's called the transcendental object equals X, which is talking about phenomenal objects. So a thing has qualities, but it also has a unity, but then that unity just turns out to be the empty form of thoughts for Kant. So he doesn't quite get there. And as I see it, that's where Badiou is in his theory of objects as well, and logics of worlds, because Badiou explicitly leans on that point in Kant and says Kant was right to say that the object is just a pure and empty form of thought. So in other words, it's still a bundle theory. OOO is not a bundle theory. It's explicitly not a bundle theory. And that comes from Husserl, because Husserl, the core of phenomenology, we all get obsessed, Husserlians and non-Husserlians, about whether or not Husserl is a realist enough. You know, Husserl disdains the thing in itself and says it's an absurdity. Any object that exists is an object that's accessible to the human intellect in principle. But what Husserl is really about is the fact that that object presents itself with many different adumbrations at many different times. So this coffee cup I'm looking at, I can rotate it in many different angles. I can raise it to different heights. I can view it in different lighting conditions and different moods. And yet I still consider it the same coffee cup. It's not a bundle of qualities because the qualities are changing constantly. And yet there's an identity to that object that persists, which means you have this ongoing tension between the object and its qualities. And he splits between the adumbrations and the essential qualities of the thing. And as far as I can tell, no one really got there before Husserl except for Aristotle, but Aristotle wasn't really analyzing the phenomenal realm of appearance, the fact that objects have an object pole and a quality pole, even in appearance. And this is something OOO picks up and runs with, and this is what leads into our version of the fourfold, slightly different from Heidegger's, but dependent on it somewhat. So, of course, in Hegel, we obviously do not find the noumena. Those are ruled out of play. But we also don't find the other 2 points I just mentioned. We don't find noumena encountering noumena, because if there are no noumena for humans, then a fortiori there are no noumena for other objects. So that's not, and Hegel's not necessarily that concerned with object-object interactions in the first place, at least not as much as he is concerned about subject-world interactions, which is the whole heart of the dialectic. We also don't really, in my opinion, we don't find a strong sense of the object quality distinction. As I've said, I think that's something coming from Husserl. It's not even found in Brentano. Brentano, Husserl's teacher, is still a bundle theorist. So it's really an insight that is very Husserlian in flavor. These are some of the ways that OOO differs most from Hegel. But there are some others that follow from this, and maybe our conversation will end up heading in this direction. One of them is that for OOO, the subject is not a key structural part of the cosmos. The subject is one entity among countless others, even if it's an unusually interesting one. And of course, this brings us in direct conflict with Hegel, with Lacan, and with Zizek accordingly. Zizek has said, for instance, that OOO is unable to think the subject. All right, but that would be like me saying that Zizek is unable to think the object, which wouldn't be fair, because of course Zizek does think the object. He just thinks of it in terms of the objet petit a from Lacan, that the object is the object cause of desire, and it's in part a retroactive projection of the subject desiring. So I wouldn't say that Zizek can't think the object. I would just say he's wrong about what he says about the object. And so I would rather Zizek not say that OOO can't think the subject. I would rather he say that OOO is wrong about the subject. Then we can have a debate. So this happens a lot, by the way. Somebody recently was saying OOO can't think race. Of course we can think race. It's not something I've written about a lot, but all OOO says is that no human issue can be at the very center of ontology, because ontology by its nature has to be broad. It can't zero in on one favored socio-political issue or on one favored even ontological issue. It has to cast a very broad net. And since humans are a very tiny part of the cosmos, that is reflected in OOO, although we are very interested in ourselves for legitimate reasons. And also there are lots of objects that need a human ingredient, such as art, in my opinion, such as society, in my opinion. So it's not like the subject plays no role whatsoever. It's not like we're trying to get rid of the human subject, as some people have misportrayed us. We're simply trying to put it in what we consider its proper place. I want to say something about aesthetics, since this is something important to me. Aesthetics is interesting to OOO because it's something not very well accounted for in current pictures of the theory of knowledge, which tend to favor prosaic literal knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge. And that is very important, but it is not a total map of human cognition. Human cognition includes a lot of things that are not what I call literal cognition. OOO often argues that knowledge comes in only two kinds, which we call undermining and overmining. If somebody asks you what something is, you can tell them what it's made of, you can tell them what it does. And I've thought long and hard about this. I see no other kind of knowledge. All kinds of things that we call knowledge are reducible to one of those two. And those are fine. We need those to survive. But when you do that, you have to realize that you are reducing an object downward or upwards. You are not getting the object itself. You're getting either its pieces or its relations. You're not getting the object itself, which is something over and above its pieces and something that is presupposed by its relations. And you're not going to be able to get at that literally, because literal statements are either undermining or overmining. A literal statement, in other words, amounts to saying this object has the following qualities. And it's a bundle theory. And science is just one example of that. To get beyond a bundle theory, you have to have the idea of an object as something other from its qualities. And that's really what OOO is about, the tense relation between objects and their qualities, the fact that they are not one and the same. There's always a difficult relation. On the simplest level, objects change their qualities and can remain the same object, Aristotle. And in a more perhaps interesting way, in aesthetic phenomena, we often see objects exchange qualities. So that looseness between objects and qualities is key for us. Now, there's something analogous to that maybe in Hegel, but not something quite like what OOO is after. But the point I wanted to make about aesthetics really is you could loosely speak of formalism and non-formalism in aesthetics. And you could loosely speak of Kant as a formalist and Hegel as a non-formalist. Oversimplification, but a useful one. Because when we speak of formalism, what we're really talking about, and Kant speaks about formalism in his ethics. I don't recall him using the word in his aesthetics, but it's there. Formalism is about the autonomy of a thing from any of its effects. So famously in Kant's ethics, an ethical action is not to be judged by whether it leads to good or bad consequences. It's to be judged in its own right. It's to be separated from how an ethical act makes us feel, by the reputation we gain or lose in the community from acting in that way. It's simply supposed to be done in its own right, for its own self. That's how Kant's ethics works. Well, a similar thing goes on in the critique of judgment with respect to his aesthetics, that an artwork for Kant should not be based on agreeability. The fact that an artwork makes me feel good. The example I always use is Field of Dreams. Since I'm from Iowa, and Iowa is usually the butt of jokes, it was nice as a young person to have an Iowa film, Field of Dreams. It made me feel good to see those Iowa cornfields not far from where I grew up. But if that interferes with my judgment to the point that I say Field of Dreams is the greatest Hollywood film of all time, then clearly I've gone off the rails. This is why Kant wants aesthetic judgment to be disinterested. He also wants it separated from any meaning, any prose meaning. So you shouldn't like an artwork for Kant simply because it has a feminist message or a Marxist message that you approve of. Those are not aesthetic factors. Those are extraneous factors. And then, of course, Kant goes so far as to say that architecture ranks quite low on the hierarchy of the arts. I've got a book coming out about this in July, Architecture and Objects, basically because architecture is useful. And so for Kant, that means it can't be a form of pure beauty. He says the same about human beauty, by the way, because if you see a person and think, wow, what a beautiful human, that's probably contaminated with lust. And the same with the beauty of a horse. Say, what a beautiful horse, that's probably contaminated with its speed, its price on the market, your ability to place a winning bet on it. And so any usefulness for Kant calls art into question. And so, of course, you would never bring in wider socio-historical considerations, the way the Frankfurt School likes to, or other groups, where you're bringing in broader cultural considerations, or the biography of the author, or the workings of capital at the time that the artist created this work. I end up critiquing Kant's formalism in a sense, because Kant's formalism ends up being very narrow. It means for him that the human and the artwork should be split. And I've argued by taking on Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried, and whom I admire, two of the most prominent formalist art critics of the 20th century, that the human and the artwork are themselves, or the human and the physical work, let's say, are both ingredients of a wider third object called the artwork. In other words, just as you need oxygen to make water as well as hydrogen, you need a human beholder as well as a physical thing to make an artwork. So I think Kant's formalism goes too far, and yet I would still adhere to a certain formalism. You can pick up Shakespeare and move Shakespeare to Indonesia in the 21st century and perform Shakespeare there, and it's still Shakespeare. Yes, it helps when you read Dickens to know about Victorian capitalism, but you can't really reduce Dickens to a critique of Victorian capitalism. There's other stuff going on there as well. You've got certain works like Uncle Tom's Cabin that are so entwined with their socio-political circumstances that they make little sense. I try to imagine Uncle Tom's Cabin as a science fiction novel about a non-existent planet where slavery never existed. It could probably be written, but it would mean something totally different. And it wouldn't be the cri de coeur that it was in a pro-slavery America of the 1850s. So certainly, formalists often try to exclude any political considerations from artworks. I would never do that. I think there are works where socio-political considerations are very much entwined with the work. I just wouldn't do it universally, just as I wouldn't for psychoanalytic criticism or any other kind. So maybe I'll finish with one last point. There's another thing that's key to the OOO method that you can find in my book, Immaterialism, that you wouldn't really be able to find in Hegel. And that's the method of symbiosis that I borrowed from Lynn Margulis's evolutionary theory. Margulis, of course, like Gould and Eldridge, is one of those people who fights Darwinian gradualism in biology, that instead of evolution happening step by step with big fish having bigger baby fish that can eat little fish, gradually over the course of millions of years produces a new fish species. Of course, for Gould and Eldridge, it's punctuated equilibrium. This happens intermittently, often due to environmental changes. I tend to prefer Lynn Margulis's model, which is what she calls serial endosymbiosis, where occasionally entities form a symbiosis and become a single life form. And by bringing that into the book Immaterialism and talking about the Dutch East India Company, which I chose because Leibniz mocks it, and I wanted to defend the objecthood of the Dutch East India Company against Leibniz, I talked about how relations are rare among objects. They don't happen, certainly not as constantly as Latour thinks, and I would say not as constantly as Hegel thinks. Relations may be happening all the time, but relations that actually change the nature of a thing, I've proposed about a half dozen times in the life of an object. And after that, it's just a matter of maturing and then declining. And I tried to show that in the case of the Dutch East India Company. The symbioses tend to happen pretty early in the history of an object. And then once an object reaches its mature form, where the symbioses are finished, it rises as it's in sync with its environment and then declines as the environment changes in ways that it's not well adapted to. And there's also a little bit of contingency allowed for by that theory. Everyone's big on contingency these days, and I think sometimes it goes too far. I think there's a place for necessity in philosophy as well. But there is quite a bit of contingency in this theory in immaterialism, that there are other symbioses the Dutch East India Company could have made, and some that it could have avoided. And its history would look very different if that had happened. All right, so I think that was my last point in this opening statement. One last thing. Of course, Hegel opposes the thing in itself, just like Husserl. Now, Husserl also has this motto, a similar motto, to the things themselves, which is not to be confused with the thing in itself. When Husserl says to the things themselves, he just means open your eyes and do phenomenological analyses on the things that are out there in the world. Now, obviously, Hegel wouldn't allow the thing in itself. I also don't think that Hegel would allow to the things themselves in the same sense as Husserl, in the sense that Husserl is very interested in objects. Husserl's whole philosophy is about objects. He says what's wrong with Brentano is Brentano thinks intentionality is about mental content. Husserl says, no, it's about object-giving acts. That's the main difference between him and his teacher. Object-giving acts means we're surrounded by objects that change their qualities but remain the same objects. So one example to end with here, Husserl legendarily spent a whole semester having his students analyze a mailbox. It's hard to imagine Hegel doing that. It's hard to imagine that a mailbox would ever be important enough to Hegel's philosophy that he would devote a whole semester to that. He would want to conduct some large-scale dialectical movement that embeds the mailbox in some wider historical framework. Husserl is just interested in the mailbox and the way it looks from different sides and how the human is able to split the essential from the inessential qualities of the mailbox. So that I just wanted to end with that as what I think the big difference between Hegel and Husserl are, even though they have a lot in common in their dismissal of Kant's Ding an sich. Sorry if that went too long.
No, that was great, Graham. Thanks. And I want to also say that I appreciate the friendly nature of the exchanges that we've had, and I agree with you. And I also want to say that I've assigned so many of your books that I think I
sorry, Todd. Sorry, I have to interrupt. Just because there's sort of like a, I don't know, like a thing coming back. Maybe it's from.
Okay. I will mute. I think my end's the problem.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. That's
so that way that
sorry about that.
You can't object to my joke. I was saying that I think I've assigned so many of your books that I've paid for that refrigerator behind you, but because I find them really helpful for laying out certain problems and certain questions. But but before I don't want to spend my time initially just responding to you, but because I think we'll have a lot of time for that. So let's kind of lay out what I think of as a central sort of I'm a little hesitant to say I have an ontology, but I think everyone has an ontology. So I'll just talk about that. So I think that what's interesting to me is that modernity, and I think this is what, Graham, you were getting to when you said that Hegel would say, or people that are Hegelian would say that you're going back to something. I wouldn't say that, but I think this is why that I think they would say that, is that modernity places, modern philosophy at least, starting with Descartes, places epistemological questions before ontological ones. Of course, this gets to its high point in Kant. And I think it's the base, but even in Descartes, it's the basis for his rejection of traditional authority. Like even though Leibniz, there's a kind of, and even Spinoza, there's a kind of regression from those epistemological questions to ontological ones. But then with Kant, it seems that the epistemological gets front and center. And then, as you pointed out, the ontological questions get bracketed to this category of the Ding an sich. And I think that is really important. And I think that for Kant, obviously, then that becomes, I mean, he bequeaths to the other German idealists this problem of the thing in itself. And I just would maybe quarrel a little bit, and we can talk about this, about what Hegel's relationship to that is. So I think that in a way, I think Hegel's idea is that I'm not going to address, and I think a lot of people have thought, oh, Hegel's just dismissing the critique of, or Kant's critique altogether, and returning to making straightforward ontological claims. You didn't say that, but that was for almost 200 years after Hegel's writing of phenomenology. That was the reading of Hegel's thought. But I think what he's doing is that he's saying every ontological claim that we make, we have to make it through epistemology, rather than sidestepping this problem of the fact that we are knowing whatever we're claiming. And it's interesting that in the logic, Hegel is very critical of Kant's, what he calls too much tenderness, or Zärtlichkeit, for things in themselves, because what he fails to see is the fact that the contradiction that divides subjectivity also has to divide things. And so it's interesting that you said that things have only a few points where they come together with other things. So Hegel's idea would be that we know that things are contradictory because we're contradictory, and we couldn't become contradictory and we couldn't even know things if they weren't in some way open to us in some kind of contradictory way. So the thing can't be any more than we can be self-identical. Things can't be self-identical. So the name Dialectics just, I think, signifies this idea that everything is contradictory, and that we can't escape contradiction. And the opposing ways of thinking about things would be a philosophy of, say, multiplicity, or a philosophy of dualism. And I think that Hegel's and this would be my position too, is very concerned with opposing those two different ideas. So his idea would be this, and my idea would be this: if things just are what they are, if they really are self-identical, then they'd lack any opening to the other, and that opening that allows them to even be destroyed or to be added to or to be known. And I think that's really crucial. But I think even the ability to grasp things requires, and this is one of the points at which Hegel is, I think, very Kantian. And I think it's interesting that you said that, and this is something we can talk about in the exchange, that you said Kant was more formalist than Hegel. My position would be the exact opposite. My position would be that Kant is formalist, but Hegel takes this concern for form even further. And I really like what you said about the role of aesthetics in thinking. And I think in the way in which aesthetics brings together the subject and the object. And I think that's right. And I think that the name for that in Kant is the sublime. And I think certainly in Hegel, but then the name in psychoanalysis is sublimation. And I think that is really a crucial point, maybe of agreement, but maybe you're not going to like how I think of that. So anyway, so for Hegel, it's the understanding, and this is discussed primarily in the preface, The Phenomenology of Spirit, that it's the understanding that divides the world and allows us to see things not as just one mass of things. And I think that's I guess that would be I don't know if this could even be a first question. I'm not sure how, if we think of subjectivity as just another object, how we are able to know which objects are divided from each other, right? Like, how do I know that the one book is separate from the stack of books? Or that to me is for Hegel, that's the labor of the understanding that does this division of the world. And then, so that's Verstand, and then reason or Vernunft is what makes the connection, sees the connection between both things. And he even calls the understanding the absolute power. So I think he's really concerned with the division between things and not just seeing the relation between things all the time. But it seems to me like that's that gets kind of left out in what you said. So anyway, so that I think that the just to hit the highlight, I think that this idea of the contradiction within subjectivity and then the contradiction within objects, and what Hegel says in the preface to Phenomenology, substance is subject. That idea is that things that seem substantial have to also be cut with, in the same way that subjectivity is at odds with themselves, in the same way that subjectivity is. So I think actually he's really, and I am really concerned for the object world as well. And maybe I couldn't imagine him doing that experiment that analysis of the mailbox, but I think that he's nonetheless concerned with, astronomical questions, questions about how the object world relates to itself. I don't think are out of bounds for Hegel, and I don't think I wouldn't call them out of bounds either. And I wouldn't either also say that the object world is all one thing and the real concern is how subjectivity relates to that. I think instead it's how those things come together. And I think that maybe is a point at which I don't know, maybe we agree, maybe we don't agree, but that I don't know. Those are just my initial thoughts. And then we can, discuss some of the things that you said.
All right, there are at least three things there I want to grab onto right away. I also have a question I want to ask you there. Let me start with the point about the sublime, because that's maybe the simplest of the three. Not that it's simple, but Stephen Shaviro, for instance, has accused OOO of being stuck in an aesthetics of the sublime. And I think the reason he thinks that is because since we have these withdrawn objects that can never be exactly known, it seems to strike resonant chord with the sublime, something that can't, goes beyond us and can't quite be put into words. I have a couple of problems with the sublime. One of them is I don't think you need to get to the sublime to get beyond words in Kantian aesthetics. Rancière has made the point that beauty is also already works that way for Kant, because beauty can't be literalized for Kant. It's known by taste. It's not known by the intellectual faculty. It's known by the faculty of judgment. The other problem I have is that sublime, both kinds of the sublime in Kant, the mathematical and the dynamical, are too amorphous for me, in the sense that he calls the mathematical sublime that which is absolutely large, and the dynamical sublime that which is absolutely powerful. And it's true in the sense that they absolutely overwhelm us, whether it's a tsunami or a landslide that's smashing everything in sight. Those have power going seemingly measurelessly beyond humans. But I'm not sure absolute is the right word. I prefer Timothy Morton's concept of hyperobjects, which pertains to very large finite numbers or very large finite powers. When he's talking about climate change, he tries to stress that the problem with the CO2 in the atmosphere isn't that it's there infinitely. The problem is that it's there for tens of thousands of years, which isn't going to do us much good. It's going to take tens of thousands of years for it to filter out of the atmosphere and back into different materials on the Earth. And Badiou and Meillassoux have become well known for replacing infinity with Cantor's many different transfinites. In a way, I think Morton performs the opposite service by replacing Kant's sublime infinites with many different large finite numbers. And that's the direction I would prefer to go. That when things are mysterious, they're finite they're mysterious in a finite way. They're not absolutes. And it may be hard exactly to measure them, but this is why I'm somewhat suspicious of the sublime. And I know, and Russell Sabrilli obviously is doing a lot with the sublime in his work too, so we've talked about that. But so I would shy away from that term. Now, you had a couple other points I wanted to get to. One of them was about objects contradicting themselves. The other was I'm going to start with the other, which is about how you know that the objects are differentiated, how to differentiate them properly. My response to that would be, of course, Kant can't, right? Because for Kant, quantity is a category of the understanding. So he speaks of the thing in itself, normally, I believe, in the singular. Maybe he also says things in themselves in plural sometimes. I'm not remembering as many passages where he does that, because he's pretty clear at one point that you can't be sure whether there are one or many. I think you can be sure that there are many. And this is one of the departures of OOO from Kantianism, simply because it's a pre-Socratic problem. If you have, like Parmenides, being, which is one, and then doxa, which is many, where's the bridge between those two? If being is one, why would there ever be many opinions? Why would there ever be many things or appearances? And this may sound like a naive proof, but to me, that's enough of a proof that the world must already be cut into certain chunks from the start. Now, of course, some of those chunks are produced by humans, factories and governments and chess games, things that we have made. But that doesn't mean that we humans as subjects or anything else have mastered those things. And so they're still outside of us. And of course, humans can make all kinds of mistakes in doing this. Humans can treat things as different that are actually the same, or vice versa. You've got the morning star and the evening star problem from Frege. Well, they turn out to be one thing. Mm-hmm. So our morning star and evening star are actually the same thing. And you've got things like 17 different symptoms that eventually turn out to be symptoms of one and the same disease, like long COVID, for example. All these crazy things that people are getting after COVID. I've read a theory that what's happening is COVID is reactivating an ancient virus that nearly killed off the human species and has been incorporated into our DNA as a result. And somehow COVID reactivates that ancient virus and causes all these side effects. I don't think it's proven yet, but that's an interesting theory. So it could be that long COVID is an actual disease with a provable cause, and it's one disease. Probably is, I would guess. So, but humans can also be wrong, right? Humans can invent crazy conspiracies, like the QAnon conspiracy theory posits this person named Q who knows all these secret things about liberal pedophiles who are, causing all these bad things to happen around the world. I think we can presume that that's bullshit, and that's simply not a real object. And so just because somebody thinks there's an object doesn't mean there's really an object. There's a sensual object there, as we call it. Anything that somebody recognizes as an object counts as a sensual object. Unicorns, anything. International banking conspiracies, those can all be sensual objects. To be a real object, that has to be something that exists outside of our our minds. And so the pre-carved status of reality has to be independent of the subject for it to be a real object. Then you made the point about things differing from themselves. Is that how you put it?
Yeah, that is how I put it.
That makes me think of Derrida right away, because, and of course, that doesn't mean that Derrida didn't get it from Hegel. I think, in a way, Derrida is more of a Hegelian than a Heideggerian. Because when I think about the difference between Husserl and Derrida, Derridians like to think that Derrida is just the logical, the legitimate heir of Heidegger, right? That he's just pushing it a little bit further. Now, I don't see it that way, and here's why. Obviously, both Heidegger and Derrida critique what they call the metaphysics of presence, the idea that reality can be directly present before the eye of the intellect. And of course, for Hegel, this takes a long process. It takes a lot of labor of the negative, and then you're still not really at that point. So I wouldn't necessarily call Hegel an ontotheologist or metaphysician of presence. But let's stick with Heidegger and Derrida for a second. When Heidegger says the metaphysics of presence is bad, for Heidegger, that's fixable by absence, right? That a thing withdraws, which means it's still there, you just can't see all of it. That's enough to fix the metaphysics of presence for Heidegger. A thing withdraws. And there's aletheia, you can gradually get towards the thing, but you can never get the thing naked in the flesh before you. That's impossible. For Derrida, that's still not enough, because for Derrida, in the case of absence, you still have self-identity, right? That if a chair is withdrawing from my perception, it's still a self-identical chair. And Derrida calls that self-presence. Now, I don't think the term self-presence really works, because I think self-presence is something only attempted by thinking subjects. You've got that in Hegel, you've got that in Husserl, and I think that's what Derrida was thinking about. That Hegel and Derrida think the truth can become present to itself. And that's not what Heidegger is about, of course, right? Heidegger is about, I would say that there's simply the self-identity of these things like hammers that are withdrawn while they're being used, and when they malfunction, suddenly become visible and therefore become present in hands. I don't see identity as a problem. I mean, I know Hegel does, I know Derrida does. I don't see that the problem is identity, just like I don't see that essence is a problem. I know Hegel also doesn't like essence in a sense. He incorporates it in his system and doesn't have as high a place as the concept. But everyone's up in arms against essentialism for understandable reasons. But I don't think the problem with essence is that it exists. The problem with essence politically is that it's knowable, or is said to be knowable. So if somebody says something like, somebody in the British colonial office back 100 years ago says, these Arabs are incapable of self-governance, that's their essence. They're a chaotic and untamed people who need the firm hand of a viceroy. Okay, well, that's essentialism in the bad sense, obviously, or that women don't have the competitive instincts necessary for the business world. Essentialism in the bad sense. But that doesn't mean that there's no difference between men and women, or that there's no difference between Egyptians and Americans, right? When I went to Egypt for the first time in 2000, I had to learn this list of cultural things you shouldn't do in Egypt as an American, mistakes you might make. Turned out some of them were nonsense. I read some of them to my students at one point, and they laughed at some of them. But some of them were obviously true. There are certain things you just don't do in Egypt, and vice versa. I had a student in Cairo whose English was so good that he had a side job telemarketing to America from Tahrir Square in Cairo every night. And so I asked him, what was the training like for that? And he said, well, his English is good enough, obviously, but he had to take a culture training course. And the first two things they told him is, when you're telemarketing to Americans, one, you can't ask them if they're married. Two, you can't ask them their salary, which is common sense in America. Those are considered personal things, private things in America. In Egypt, it's very common to ask those questions. Taxi drivers were asking me if I was married all the time. Maybe they want to play matchmaker or something. A surprising number of people would ask me my salary, which in America is like the secret index of your worth. And so no one would reveal it unless they have to in negotiation. So, and this is my problem with Edward Said while we're at it, that Edward Said, on the one hand, he does a great job of laying out all kinds of horrible exploitation. And if you want to read an Orientalist horror story, just read Flaubert's Letters from Egypt, which is one of the most disgusting books I've ever read, the way he treats Egyptians in that book. But then Said pushes it too far in this same sense and says, anyway, there's no such thing as an Egyptian. There's just a bunch of individual Egyptians. You can't generalize. Okay, well, you don't want to stereotype, but if you say there's no such thing as Egypt, there's only individual Egyptians, you start sounding like Margaret Thatcher saying society doesn't exist. There's only individuals and families. If you're willing to say that society exists, and I do too, then there are certain things you can safely say about Egypt and not say about the United States. Like that, you can't be dismissive of religion in Egypt the way a typical secular intellectual in the United States would be dismissive about religion in a typical conversation. Religion and politics are seen as more of a natural partner in Egypt than for us with our separation of church and state. The reason for that partly is that when you separate church and state, or mosque and state in Egypt, the religion part gets stronger, whereas in America, it would get stronger when you tie them together. And so armies always want to keep a firm hand governmentally on religions in that part of the world, because otherwise they see religion as accelerating out of control and having revolutions and toppling regimes. So there are cultural reasons why there are differences on that. So anyway, all of that is a long-winded way of saying that I think you can make essentialist statements while keeping in mind that they're always going to be short. Like, if you're going to make an essentialist statement about the Scandinavians, keep in mind that, yes, now they're the most humane, liberal welfare states in Europe, gender equality and all that, but 1,000 years ago, they were the terrors of the Western world, raping and pillaging and burning down monasteries. So a lot of the things that we consider essential traits may be surface traits. I'll give you one last one. Everyone now thinks of the United States as a global imperialist power. Okay, but at one point, the United States was also an isolationist power that didn't want to get its hands dirty with all the evil things that Europe was doing. So it seems like if there's an essence to American politics, it's not interventionist or isolationist, but moralist, right? Because both of those things can be justified in moralizing terms. So you have to make sure you're going deep enough to get towards where the essence is. Anyway, Todd, the question I was going to ask you was, you think Hegel's more of a formalist? I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah. Okay. I think you have to mute, Graham. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I will answer that, but first I want to address. I don't disagree really with what you said about essence. I mean, I think Hegel's point about in the doctrine of essence, and I think I pretty much subscribe to this, is that essence unfolds temporally, right? And I think that's what you're saying about the Scandinavian thing and even about the American thing. So I don't necessarily have a problem with that at all. Like, and I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I would say that. And I also don't agree with, sorry, that was a funny slip. I don't disagree with the point about the refutation of Parmenides and that, of course, right. Like there have to be multiple things that really exist. I mean, one of my questions though is, and you make, in fourfold object or what's it called? No, I butchered the title.
Quadruple object.
Quadruple object, yeah. I Heideggerianized your title. Sorry about that. Yeah, the quadruple object, and then in the New Theory of Everything book, like you make a lot of, and you just did in what you said to me, you make a lot of this difference between the sensual and the real object, right? And I think, I mean, and I think you're right to say that Q and that whole conspiracy is not a real object, right? But I don't think you couldn't get 75% of Americans to agree with you, right? Like you couldn't. So it's interesting, like what it can't be a vote. Like what determines what is a real object and what's just a sensual object, right? Like I think that to me is where it seems like triple O. By the way, I find one of my questions is what's the best triple O joke? Because I haven't, I'm not sure if I've gotten one, but I take your pronunciation thing as a little joke. So I like that. And although I'm tempted to respond perversely and always call it OOO, but okay, I'll pronounce it your way. So, but my question is like, isn't there a secret epistemology within triple O that allows this real sensual distinction? And then because you feel pretty confident Q conspiracy, it doesn't exist as a real object, but what gives you the grounding to make that kind of claim? So that's my question. Sublimation. Okay. I mean, I don't necessarily do, I mean, part of what I would say to the point about the amount of carbon in it, like, I don't know. That seems fine to me. I guess for me, the question of sublimation is and maybe this is uninteresting to you, and that's totally fine. But for me, the question of sublimation is a question of what counts for us, right? Like what makes something count for us as valuable? And I think it has to undergo some kind of act of sublimation to count for us as valuable. And I think this, to me, this is what Marx doesn't see about the way capitalism functions, right? That it's not just labor creates surplus value. There also has to be, and I think like this is what Don Draper does, right? He creates sublime values, and thus things are count, like people would do more for a certain object, certain commodity than they would do for anything else, right? Like they would do for their spouse, or they would do for whatever. So that's why, for me, sublimation has a really important place, not necessarily ontologically, but just in terms of like the structure of society and why we do what we do. Okay. Why do I think Hegel's more of a formalist? So I think that because I can see why you would think that was a suspect claim, because he dismisses or challenges Kantian ethics for being too formalist, right? I think all of the moves in Hegel's philosophy, and one of the things I should say is I think all of his books are basically the same book. I don't think that there's like this one and then there's the other. And I think he's basically, I mean, this is true of most of us, but I think with him, it's absolutely true that for Heidegger makes a big deal of the difference between phenomenology and logic. I think that there's not a difference. And I think his move always is to pay attention to, so a certain position, and he's always trying to see how a position undoes itself, right? Unfolds, and like by tracing out how the drama of that position, I would say. Like rather than, I think one of his revolutions in philosophy is to say, philosophy isn't about making arguments. Instead, it's about enacting dramas. So I think there's a real, again, to bring it back to this aesthetic, I think there's a real aestheticization of philosophy, ironically, because he announces the end of art, but I think his philosophy is the most artistic. So, okay. But I think when he dramatizes a position, he thinks positions, whatever the position, let's just take sense certainty, like it deceives itself by thinking it is its content. And then he dramatizes it by saying, well, what's the logic of its form? And then we'll see what it really thinks. And part of the form of sense certainty, for instance, is to rely on here, this, now, right? Like these, what he says are necessarily, because they're linguistic term, universals, right? So that there's no, the form of it actually undermines the claims of its content, right? So that's why I would say that, and Kant, in certain way thinks of himself as a formalist philosopher, but I don't think that he pays attention to form quite as religiously as Hegel does. So that's what I would say.
Actually, that last point is interesting. It could be that Kant is too focused on the content of artworks and is not as focused on something like the medium, say, which his formalist successors are, to their credit. Clement Greenberg focuses on nothing more than the flatness of the background canvas. But that's a fair point. I could see it's a very good dialectical point. In a sense, it looks like Hegel doesn't care about form, but actually it's Kant who's not. Yeah. All right. There are a couple other things in there. Let me start with Q first. I'm not sure you really need a philosophical argument to say that Q is wrong. This is something that we do as citizens rather than as ontologists, I think. Just like we find stories believable or unbelievable. We have to judge whether things seem to hang together, whether the person seems truthful with us. And I just don't see anything there in the Q theory that's remotely plausible. From John F. Kennedy Jr. still being alive and helping Trump secretly hunt down liberal pedophiles, Hillary sexually abusing kids in the basement of a pizza parlor that doesn't have a basement. It just gets worse and worse from there. Italian TV antennas being used to interfere with the 2020 election results somehow. It almost seems like they're trying to make fun of people by seeing how far they can get them to go. But that linked to your question about epistemology. And yeah, OOO has a fairly hostile attitude towards epistemology for the reason that I see epistemology as just a form of unconvincing ontology. It's an ontology in which the thought world relation has priority over all relations. And the reason for that, of course, would be that the thought world relation is given to us in a way that the others aren't. And because I open my eyes, here I am. It seems to be a world, but there's also my thought present here too. And so to get to an object-object relation would seem to be some, gross, quick jump to some other realm that I don't have direct access to. First thing I would say about that is I think actually I'm not a huge fan of Wilfred Sellers, but they would say that inferences already saturate all of our perceptions. His idea of the myth of the given, that inferences are everywhere. And I agree with that. I think that's already there in phenomenology anyway, but that's one thing. The other thing is, I don't think you get the thought world distinction directly, right? There's already has to be a deduction to distinguish between the thought pole and the world pole. And then in Kant's case, there already has to be a deduction to reach our finitude. I don't open my eyes and say, oh, I'm finite. It takes 2,000 years of the history of philosophy for Kant to make that point. And if we can deduce that we're finite, we can also deduce that objects are finite and that in their interactions, they're finite. And so for me, it's not, more needs to be written about this in order to persuade people. I agree with that, because people aren't persuaded. A lot of people simply dismiss OOO because they think we go back to a pre-transcendental dogmatism, just like they would say that about Whitehead. But so I agree that people need more persuading. I don't agree that it's that difficult to do. I don't think it'll take more than 20 tightly written pages to convince a lot more people that we don't need this transcendental turn. Not that Kant did nothing, but that, because I accept the thing in itself, I just think it needs to be expanded to object-object interactions, which, by the way, is why Whitehead isn't good enough for me, because Whitehead reduces the objects to their relations with each other. He doesn't allow them to be unexpressible residues lying behind those relations. That would be naive for Whitehead. For OOO, OOO is kind of like Whitehead plus Heidegger in a way. You've got this cosmic interaction of all different objects so that it's not Dasein at the center, but you've also got this withdrawnness or in itselfness. So it's funny, even Heideggerians don't go that big for the thing in itself, even though there's a passage in Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics where he clearly says what the German idealists all missed, but when they try to get rid of the thing in itself, is this concept of finitude. And he emphasizes human finitude, whereas I wouldn't, but Heidegger's aware that something is lost in that turn to German idealism. I got another question for you now, Todd, and this is actually about Badiou and Zizek, and I don't want to tar you with the same brush if you disagree with them. But one thing that's always puzzled me about Badiou, Zizek, and even Meillassoux, they're always quick to praise Heidegger as an important thinker. They're not Heideggerians in any sense, but they're always quick to praise Heidegger, especially Zizek. If you talk to Zizek even privately about Heidegger, he'll say, wow, this guy was the real deal. This guy was incredible. They don't have as much use for Husserl. Badiou and Meillassoux claim that they know Husserl well and respect what he did, but when you start talking to them or reading them, it's pretty clear they really don't get Husserl at all. They're minimizing what he did. They're treating him as just another. Meillassoux treats him as someone who describes. Well, lots of people describe. And Badiou kind of treats him as a rationalist who came a bit too late, an old-fashioned rationalist who came a bit too late. They totally miss the object-quality tension, which is the heart of Husserl. That's what the eidetic reduction is all about. But let's go back to Heidegger, because they all at least appreciate Heidegger. And yet Heidegger then leaves very little trace in their philosophies. And so if like Zizek, Badiou, and Meillassoux, you're in a sense recalling Hegel more than you're recalling phenomenology in Heidegger, what do you say about phenomenology in Heidegger? Do you say that they just strayed from the path and became neo-Kantians? Because I've heard some Hegelians say that. What do people like Husserl and Heidegger really add to philosophy that isn't there in Hegel? And if they don't, if they're just neo-Kantians, then why do people like Zizek and Badiou keep saying that Heidegger was the last universally great philosopher? And I'm not asking you to speak on their behalf, but you're sort of.
I certainly can't speak. I mean, you would be more qualified to speak on behalf of Meillassoux than me. I can't speak on his behalf at all. But I would just say about Badiou, it's interesting that you locate him with Hegel, because I see him as the, other than OOO and a few other people today, he seems like one of the great anti-Hegelians of our time, because he's very insistent. Maybe Theory of Subject is a little Hegelian, which is why I think it's his best book, but certainly in Being an Event, there's an absolute non-dialectical relation between situation and event, right? So I actually think, I've read his he hasn't written a book, but I guess he wrote a little thing with Barbara Cassin about Heidegger, and women, I think, or Heidegger, I forget. But it was a kind of slight thing. But he did a whole seminar on Heidegger. And so I think that there is, for him at least, there is more of a sense that he is I think Badiou, I almost think he gets, if from that, for it's not the early Heidegger for him, whereas for you, I think it much more is, right? Like it's much more tool, like the problem of tool being, and that's all, those are all problems from Sein and Zeit. For Badiou, it's much more the mid 30s, I think, and the Beiträge, right? Like that, and I think he gets from there. I almost think his notion of event owes more to Heidegger than it does to anyone else. So I don't know that he would say that, but because when he talks about Heidegger, he emphasizes his distance from him. But I see him as a not. I mean, you mentioned his debt to Kant before. I think he's a kind of Kantian Heideggerian. I see him as utterly hostile to the Hegelian psycho. I mean, not. He like makes some overtures to Lacan in psychoanalysis, but I kind of think he's because he's anti-dialectical, I think he's basically hostile to that project. Slavoj is an interesting case. Like, I think, so I'll just say I grew up more Heidegger than anybody else. So it was precisely being in time, but not in the way that, I don't think the passages and the things that you're concerned with. So for me, it was basically Das Mann and Sein zum Tod. Like that was so the they and being toward death. And that was to me, and my project as a young, thankfully I passed this, but my project was to connect Heidegger to Marx and to say, like, oh, we lack the proper revolutionary position because we haven't acceded to our being towards death. And so for me, that was Heidegger's great contribution. And I still think that's an important, I think Heidegger's Das Mann becomes Lacan's big other. So I think that that would be one way I would say Slavoj does evince the influence, but his first books in Slovene were all on Heidegger. So I think part of it for him is a anxiety of, wanting to get away from this initial position that he had. But so those are more biographical, I guess. So, but to the nature of the question in terms of like, what's the importance in history of philosophy? I think that I do think that I understand why phenomenology developed. And I also, I understand especially why it's important for you, although I think you have to admit there is a kind of irony that the philosophy focused solely on appearances becomes central for a triple O, which wants to cherish the real object, right? So I find that at least ironic. But not to say that you can't argue that through. I think you could. But I think that one of the things that happened was that Hegel got so distorted, in part by Schelling, in part by then Kierkegaard, and primarily by Marx. I think that all of a sudden he became this thinker of progressive history, right? Like Hegel is a thinker of Nachträglichkeit, of retroactivity, not of progressive history. So when that gets written into Marx as like, this is what Hegel's dialectic, then I think, and then it becomes also, and then the wildly overemphasized importance of philosophy of history, then, and this is what I think in large part Kierkegaard's reacting against. And I think phenomenology too, like the sense that he's made this huge dialectic and he's forgotten about the problem of perception, like the individual, how we relate to things. He's forgotten about that by making this huge dialectic. And so I don't know, I like Kierkegaard says Hegel forgets about the problem of subjectivity. Well, you would obviously agree with that, but I think in some way Husserl kind of thinks the same thing. And I think, I guess my explanation would be, phenomenology develops as it does because there's this wildly wrong sense of what Hegel thinks, and he's not there to correct it. And Marxism's incredible importance in history of just the world and thought, and then that he gets kind of, and it's only, I don't think it's a coincidence that Slavoj writes Sublime Object in 1989, and that's Fall of Berlin Wall. It's those two things are simultaneous. Like this okay, Gillian Rose writes Hegel Contra Sociology is kind of moving this direction 83, but it's really in 89. And then, so I think that you have to get rid of the Marxian overlay in order to have the real Hegel come out. And so I think that that's a main part of, at least that's how I understand it for myself.
Yeah, you're right about what you said about Badiou and Hegel. I should have been more specific because, of course, there is no dialectic in Badiou, and all the other things you said are also accurate. Badiou's theory of objects and logics of worlds is really Kantian more than, it's certainly not Hegelian. What I was referring to by calling Badiou a Hegelian was only on the limited position of the thing in itself. It's easy to read inconsistent multiplicity in being an event as a kind of noumena, but it's not. It's the retroactive production of a count that's already been made. And Brassier at least argues that, and I think rightly, that it's the void that really stands behind consistent multiplicities. And so in that sense, yeah, that's the only sense in which I meant that Badiou and Zizek and Meillassoux belong to Hegel. That currents their refusal to acknowledge the thing in itself as having a role in philosophy. Now, I know Zizek tries to bring it back in an interesting way. It's the traumatic kernel, but it's still too much like the Lacanian real to me, rather than what I would call a Heideggerian real, which is something that's really there, independent of us, whether we like it or not. You said something else that I wanted to get into. You said something about phenomenology and subjectivity. Okay, yeah, there's something to that, obviously. But I think sometimes people forget that Husserl was a full-blown rationalist. For example, there's Knox Peden's interesting book, Spinoza Contra Phenomenology, where he talks about the war in 20th century French philosophy between the phenomenological influence and the rationalist strand, forgetting that Husserl is also a rationalist. Now, the kinds of rationalists we get today tend towards what I would call scientism, unapologetically. And Husserl obviously is the enemy of that. And that's why a lot of the more scientifically inclined continental philosophers today, like Brassier and his circle, have no time for Husserl, because they want us to sit there and describe appearances instead of going beyond appearances by means of scientific concepts. All right, but Husserl is still a rationalist. He's still their ally in some sense. There's no mysticism in Husserl. There's no mystery in things, really. You can actually exhaust the essence of things if you follow the proper procedures. There was something else now that's just flitting around the side of my mind. I hate being older now because my memory is noticeably declining. It used to be quite good. Oh, you said you found it ironic that Triple O can find inspiration in phenomenology. Okay, yes, Husserl doesn't have the element of the real there. There are no real objects in Husserl. And he's quite harsh about this. Mm-hmm. He's quite harsh about the idea that there could be such a thing as merely intentional objects. He thinks his intentional objects are the real objects. If they're not real, then they're not really objects. So if you think you're seeing a centaur, the centaur qualities might be there, but it's not really a centaur object because that object doesn't exist. This is why Husserl is supplemented with Heidegger in Triple O. And that wasn't designed that way ahead of time. What happened is just that at some point I realized, wait a second, Husserl's object and Heidegger's object are not the same things. Because Heidegger's objects are there, whether Dasein, I guess you might make the argument that everything that exists is correlated with Dasein and Heidegger, but there's also a sense of independence of the things in Heidegger, that being gives itself to us, right? Sends itself to us. It's not something we have control over. Whereas in Husserl, there just isn't anything hidden. People say his horizon is sufficient to account for hiddenness, but it's not. A horizon is just something there that's already present that we haven't noticed yet, like a background medium that we haven't noticed yet. Husserl absolutely excludes anything deep, let's say. Heidegger requires it. But what Triple O gets out of Husserl is the idea that there are objects even in the phenomenal realm. So even if you're just talking about mere appearance and it's all false, it's still an object and it's still in tension with its qualities. A fictional character still doesn't fit well with all possible qualities. A fictional character still has a certain nature, and you can say, that's not believable. I just watched the final episode of Ozark last night after watching it for the past 5 years, and I wasn't satisfied with everything, but I thought it was all fairly believable. You know, if certain things had happened that just weren't believable for certain characters, I think we would have been appalled. Some of my friends were appalled by whichever Batman had Danny DeVito as was it the Penguin?
Penguin.
Because they said, Danny DeVito was interesting, but the character wasn't the Penguin. And I actually never saw that movie, but I could see how that would play out. They tried to stylize it too much, and it wasn't the Penguin we know from comic books. So you can make mistakes like that. You can make mistakes with fictional characters. You can have Sherlock Holmes do something that Sherlock Holmes really wouldn't have done, and so therefore it fails. Even though he's a fictional character, and you think the author has absolute demiurgic power over what to do. This also led back to something you said about a theory of knowledge for OOO. How can we determine what's real and what's not real? Well, the fact is we can't always tell what's real and what's not real. We can do a better job of it, but there's no way that human knowledge is going to get to a final version of the truth. And you can see this from the history of science. The way that the bases of theories in the history of science change, not constantly, but intermittently, with what Kuhn calls paradigm shifts. So since the past 100 years or so, we've been basing our science on quantum theory and relativity, which are still incompatible. And yet, since they both work well, we use them both, despite the contradiction. And since the early 70s, we've had the standard model of particle physics to handle the quantum side of it. But now, not only do we have that contradiction, we have dark matter and dark energy, which we have no idea what to do with in that schema. So there's probably going to be another Einstein at some point. And so we're doing the best we can with the paradigm we have now. And so nobody thinks we have a final physics. We don't have a final philosophy, because people are going to come up with other things in the future. And I actually think one of the strongest aspects of Badiou is his theory of anti-philosophy. The fact that he thinks philosophy has to work as closely to anti-philosophy as possible. I'm not a theory of his being part of his philosophy. I'm a fan of the event part of his philosophy, right, not of his being part. And that's because I think there is a certain irreducible subjective element in truth, the element of a conversion. And it's no surprise to me that he likes St. Paul and Kierkegaard and Pascal, despite being a vehement atheist, and why St. Paul is so foundational for Badiou, despite his being a vehement atheist. I think that there is something at the heart of truth. I don't like the word truth. I like reality. Because for me, people say truth when they think they already have it, usually. Reality means you've encountered something that you have to deal with. You just don't quite know how to deal with it yet. And to me, what distinguishes the highest caliber of thinkers is people who aren't willing to throw reality under the bus to fit a theory. People who are attentive to the fact that not everything works in their theory, and they're still trying to piece together how something is going to fit into their philosophy. So...
Yeah, isn't that, a couple things. That's really good and helpful. Isn't that isn't that what absolute knowing names for Hegel? The absolute failure to fit everything within the theory. That's how I read absolute knowing. So that's the first thing I would say. And it's interesting because I'm going to come back to this point about, because I think to me this epistemological question is the crucial question. And I still am not sure how. I understand it can be, struggle, and we can fight it out and we can debate it, the distinction between what constitutes an actual real object, right? But you were, I want to come back to the Q thing, because okay, you're right. I don't think it's less crazy than you think it is, right? But let's say the theory was Judeo-Bolshevism is responsible for all the evils that are besetting German society. I don't know, that may not have been true. Obviously it wasn't true, but it wasn't real. But if you asked the garden variety German, they would have said it was. So it wasn't I think it's important that Q is a minority. Right now it's a minority report, but it doesn't have to stay a minority report. And so that's, I guess, to me, the I guess I can't get out of this word, like the bypassing of the epistemological question opens up a kind of, I guess, arbitrariness of like, okay, this is a real object, this isn't. And like if I was a Q supporter, you're like, well, it's just unreasonable. But I wouldn't find it unreasonable. Like I would find it perfectly like the Q supporter finds it perfectly reasonable, just like the garden variety German finds the explanation that Judeo-Bolshevism is responsible for all the ills in Germany. They find it perfectly reasonable. So I guess I'm not, I guess I'd like a little bit more explanation of this way of how you decide where to cut. And then just back to the other question, which I think is looming, the other big question is looming large, is this idea about that we can't think the relation between objects. Like I think that, I don't think that's a Hegelian point. Like I think he wants to think the relation between objects all the time. He just wants to think it through the epistemological problem that Kant bequeaths him, right? So I don't think that, I think maybe you move a little too quickly to say, oh, he doesn't care about that. No, he does care about that. He just thinks you can't think about it directly. And I think you want to say, no, you can think about it directly, but then I think there's a whole epistemological problem that gets to what I had just asked. So that's the whole thing.
Well, because of Tripolo's commitment to withdrawal, you can't ever actually think anything directly. You can point at something directly, but you can't have it directly before you. And it's interesting what you bring up about, okay, the Judeo-Bolshevism is responsible for everything theory. How would you combat that if you were in Germany and had the courage to do so? You couldn't do it by taking a piece of paper and saying, see, this is proof that it's not true. No, because that's not really how truth works. You can't look through a microscope and see the truth, except in some very limited cases. You have to, you could do some ideology critique. You could say, isn't it just the case that you're projecting onto the outsider a threat to the wholeness of German society, even though there was never any wholeness of German society? It was always riven with conflict, which is what I think someone like Zizek would do. Society is always turned against itself, and the idea that you're going to throw out the Jew or throw out some other outsider is a false solution to attain a non-existent purity that no society ever has. I'm happy with that. Okay, there are some cases that are a little more interesting, like the Kennedy assassination. I'm one of the majority of Americans who don't believe that it was just Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't know where you stand on this. So I don't have any proof that there was a conspiracy, but there are just too many things about the story that don't seem believable to me. There are lots of rational people out there who say that it was just Lee Harvey Oswald. There are logical books written saying, look, I know it seems strange, but it was just Lee Harvey Oswald, and there really was a magic bullet that went at 4 different angles in his body and hit Connolly or whatever it was. And then when I went to visit the site for the first time, I found that I disagreed with certain aspects of the conspiracy theory. Like one of the aspects is Oswald wasn't a good enough shot to pull that off. And then when I went into the Texas School Book Depository and looked down, it doesn't look as far to Kennedy's car as I thought it would. It looks conceivable to me that a Marine could shoot that many shots and hit the people from that distance. So I didn't become even more of a conspiracy theorist globally on all aspects when I went there. There are just some things that are strange, the hobos behind the wall on the grassy knoll, and there was the CIA had reasons to get rid of Kennedy. The fact that he had canceled what's it called, Operation Northwoods, where they were going to do terrorism against Americans and blame it on Cuba. There were lots of reasons to think the people backing Allen Dulles would have wanted to. Anyway, so there are cases where I think we all have a couple of conspiracy theories, at least, that we're partial to. And why do I believe that one and not believe Q, or not believe, what's another one? There's another one I don't, there's some that are common that I don't believe. They're just slipping my mind at the moment. I think Jeffrey Epstein was probably murdered. I don't know what the percentage is on that. It just seems way too suspicious. Too many intelligence agencies wanted him dead. The cameras were down. The 2 guards were asleep. Come on. A lot of people out there wanted Epstein dead. So yeah. How is it that you decide those things? Well, the way I try to decide it is, does somebody have extremely strong political motives for saying this theory? If they do, then I tend to be suspicious of it. So Q, it's tailor-made to feed Trumpianism, which I oppose, but even if I supported it, like I remember, I'm closer to the Democratic side. And when Paul Wellstone died in that plane crash, the very liberal senator from Minnesota, there were a lot of conspiracy theories on the left from that. I never was quite convinced by that. I thought, look, small planes crash all the time. It was Minnesota in the winter. There were some reports about the pilot having a bad history. Who knows? So I never was convinced by that. So I think that's the first thing I do is ask, are there really primarily political motives behind this theory? If not, then I tend to take it a little more seriously. Not that political conspiracies don't happen. But I think you see more uniformity across the political spectrum in doubting the Kennedy official theory. What's interesting about the leak of the Roe v. Wade decision, which of course isn't the point, I think the decision's the point, but you can make a plausible case that it was someone on the left or on the right who leaked it. I've heard plausible theories for both. And I guess you can only figure that out empirically with an investigation. And you got to trust that the investigation's not biased, of course. Assuming it's not biased. And then, of course, there are some conspiracy theories that have a political basis that I do agree with, like the January 6th was a conspiracy. I think to me, that's pretty obvious. And there is political reasons for believing that, which is that to believe that Trump is a uniquely dangerous figure in the last 100 or so years of American politics. I don't think there's a philosophy that can provide a guarantee epistemologically that one theory is true or another is true. And to give one last example, let's get into climate change a little bit, because climate change is maybe one of the first scientific theories, and I think we're going to have more of these, where you can't really separate out the political aspect of it. You can't look in a microscope and say, oh, there's climate change, we've discovered it. You have to look at all these indicators. And for my purposes, there's enough indicators that it's happening. But you're always going to have 3 or 4% of scientists who say it's not happening. And yes, there have been cases in the past where a minority of scientists were right and the majority were wrong. But Bruno Latour writes about this, that this is a case where it's not a simple battle between facts and fairies. To figure out that global warming is happening, you need to trust science as an institution. You need to trust all the peer review processes. You need to trust measurements. You need to trust instrumentation. You need to trust certain definitions. There's going to be the occasional unscrupulous researcher who fudges the data to make climate change look a little worse than it is. And that leads the skeptics to deny it. But then you can take on the ridiculous theories like, hey, it snowed at my house yesterday in May, therefore climate change isn't happening. Because that's just a fallacy. There are going to be local variations. So I think we're headed to a place where science is more like that, where science resembles more an argument in the social sciences, where there is no definite, or the humanities is better, where there is no definite data point that's going to convince everyone. It's just going to be a gradual case made out of many different factors. And that's why I would reject the Nazi conspiracy theories, not because I have a piece of paper proving that the Jews don't control the world, just that it seems so racist and so ridiculous that I would be extremely reluctant to believe any theory such as that without huge amounts of supporting data, because otherwise it just looks like a racist conspiracy theory.
Sorry, Todd. Could I just because I just want to interject a little to help maybe clarify the issue here, and then I'll let you go. Just because I like that. Graham, you mentioned that there's no guarantee for what's a real object, and I think that's similar to something like Lacan would say, like there's no metalong, like there's no way we can, like, we are finite, we can't tell, there is no guarantee, right? But I think, like earlier, Todd, you mentioned how the division of objects is, for Kant, Hegel, for the German idealists, that's a product of our understanding, or that's an act of the understanding. But I think I just want to maybe clarify the issue here and see if you agree with me here, that for you, Todd, the issue with OOO is that they would say something like there's no guarantee for what's real, or what's a real object or not. But at the same time, they're like Dr. Harman would say that there is a division of objects, as if we can bypass, the like there's a division of objects before the understanding. So I think that was the issue, and I think we were kind of missing that, getting bogged down in the details of like Q and all that. But maybe if you could just touch, like, I know, you were going to get into that. So
Trey, no, I thanks for interjecting that. That's exactly what I was going to say. Right. I think that like I'll just take Graham your example from the object-oriented ontology theory of everything, right? I think, is that the book where you talk about Civil War and Vicksburg as the, yeah, okay. So I really have to say, I really liked the analysis of Civil War. I thought it was really good, maybe the best I've read, so I appreciated that. But I didn't think it made your point. Like I thought, I mean, one of my questions is, like one of the things you want to claim is the Civil War is a real object, right? But, and this comes to the question Trey or the point that Trey just raised, like how do we know, like, the distinctiveness of the Civil War? Like I think you could make a really good case that no, the Civil War actually started with the Missouri Compromise, right? And the Civil War, and I think I would say this, the Civil War didn't end until 1964 or something, right? Like I think, you know, like how you define the object and where you limit it is utterly crucial. And that is a social, political, cultural, everything kind of question, right? Like where you decide to delimit the Civil War is huge. It's like, that's a political question. And I don't think you can just say, we just all know, or let's take a survey, or because people on the right are going to say, well, the Civil War started and ended at a different time than people on the left are going to say, right? Like there's no agreement on that. They're not going to say, well, it's the firing on Fort Sumter and then it was Appomattox. Like, okay, in some sense, that's right. But to talk about it as an object, that I think that what delineates it is not exactly clear. Just like German idealism, it's an object, right? Or like, but where does it end and where does it begin, right? Like I think that though that's the point about, it's the understanding that has to make that cut to determine when the object, where to divide what is the object from what isn't the object, I think. And that's where I see an epistemology being smuggled in OOO in a way that I think you would say doesn't. Obviously, you would say that's not what OOO is doing, but I think there is a kind of secret epistemology at work to decide, okay, this is where, and you say it's Fort Sumter and it's Appomattox. That's like, those are the endpoints, but why? Like what, I mean, like you could easily, and I think if you move it later, it changes the political bearing of everything in terms of the way you address what is the object. I think the same thing is true of the tree that's outside my door. I mean, it's a little less, it seems a little more cut and dried, like, okay, where the root ends, but wait a minute, the root is now, it's kind of taking nutrients from outside of it, right? Like this is Hegel's point, I think, that objects are constantly interacting with their environment. They're never self-identical, you know, I think in the way that OOO wants them to be, right? Like that, like even in the way that I eat, if I eat an apple, or if I just take a drink of water, all of a sudden something that wasn't me becomes part of me. And then when is the water me? Is it already me? Or is it just has to wait till it really gets into my bloodstream? Or like that? I mean, I think that to me those are questions of the understanding.
All right. The part of your point is simply saying that history is never an exact science, or delineating which object belongs here and which object belongs here is never an exact science. And I think that's just the way reality is. To distinguish between real and sensual objects does not mean I claim to have a foolproof method for identifying them in every case. You're right. Somebody could write an account of the Civil War that was totally different from mine. It could even be an object-oriented ontologist who did that. And we simply disagree. Someone might say, like you just did, that it goes from the Missouri Compromise through 1964. But if I were to agree with someone, there's a difference between real object and sensual object, at least we would have a common method to put into play. There are certain things you can do to try to figure out what's a real object, what's not a real object. One of the things is that real objects can have different qualities at different times, right? And Aristotle already said this about substance, so that if something never changes its aspect, has no ambiguity, it's probably not an object. In the case of that Civil War analysis in that book, and also the analysis of the Dutch East India Company, I was looking for, when I'm talking about symbiosis, I'm looking for things that change the object irreversibly in some sense. So in the case of the Dutch East India Company, once this guy Kern, who was the most hard-boiled governor of the Dutch East India Company, proposed back to Amsterdam this absolutely horrifying manifesto that the Dutch East India Company, in order to stay profitable, needed to violently attack all the other European powers and to prevent Asians from trading with each other, right? That the Dutch East India Company would have to be the middleman for all trade in Asia. And of course, in Amsterdam, which was already pretty liberal, there was a lot of trepidation over that. And so Kern forced their hands by having his associate massacre a bunch of British at their fortress after inviting them for dinner, thereby making it impossible to have peace with the other Europeans. Okay, that was a definite irreversible change in the company because it can no longer interact peacefully with the other European powers. It was in a permanent state of war after that with the British, with the French, with the Spanish and Portuguese, not to mention with the Asians. And so it had to exert this iron grip. And it wasn't all unjustified, by the way. The Netherlands were fighting for their lives at the time against Spain, right? They had rebelled against Spain to get their independence, and they needed a lot of money to continue to fend off the Spanish. So there are certain things you look for when you're looking for a symbiosis that I'm not saying they can spawn universal agreement. That doesn't happen already with any other existing theories, right? You can have two Weberians who disagree about the changes in society, right? You can have two Lacanians or Freudians who disagree violently about certain points. So it's not like Lacan even provides us with a foolproof method for analyzing a specific patient. There's always going to be disagreements. So I don't think OOO is any more flimsy in that respect than any other theory that exists. It's just providing different standards by which to judge what's real and what's not real. I wouldn't call it an epistemology. I would call it a method, because an epistemology for me is very subject heavy. It involves starting with the subject-object relation as being the center of reality. Whereas for me, it's more about things you're spying in the object. And yes, it's you who's spying the things in the object, but when we're studying objects, we're studying objects. We're not studying ourselves. Yes, we are finite. And so we're not seeing all aspects of a thing that a dog or a mosquito or some 25th century human would see, but we are still paying attention to the object, not so much to the relation. For me, that's a good thing. You reminded me of one of your other points. It'll come back to me, but I'll stop now.
Okay. Yeah, I want to pick up this changes the object irreversibly. So yeah, I like that. I mean, I like that. So, and active symbiosis. I like that too, except here's my problem with it. I think that when I just drank this glass of water, I was changed irreversibly, right? Like how do like certain cells of mine changed, they reproduce, they some died off probably at that moment, right? Like some aspect of my intestine has undergone a change that it'll never come back. Like, right? So it seems to me like who says what is an irreversible change that really counts as irreversible, right? Like, I think, I would say it seems to me like that's where a kind of political, social, existential valuation comes in on the part of the person making the judgment. It doesn't, I mean, okay, yeah, I agree. It has something to do with the object for sure. And it's the change. I agree. We should pay attention to that. But I don't like, once you say change the object irreversibly, I just don't understand how it's not, if that, it seems to me like that's happening all the time. So to say which changes that are irreversible really count requires this intervention on the part of subjectivity to say that's what really counts and that's what doesn't count, right? Like when I got Lyme disease, that was a change that really counted for my body. But when I drank this glass of water, that didn't count. Or when I got pneumonia, that was a change that really counted. But when I ate 5 pieces of cake in a day and gained a pound, that wasn't a change that really counted, right? So all these things are true things that have happened to me. So I that's my question, right? Like, what isn't it like? Who says what's counts as an irreversible change when every change is irreversible all the time?
It's funny you should bring up this point, because this was precisely my reason for breaking with Latourian actor network theory in that book, Immaterialism, because for me, the problem with actor network theory is that it treats all changes as equal, right? And so as I put it in the book, if you're going to do an actor network theory analysis of the Dutch East India Company, you'd be left with having all these events involving cells in people's bodies and major business transactions and major wars. And the only real difference between them would be quantitative, right? That certain of those changes affected the rest of the world more. And so it ends up making every incident too dependent on the entire network of the universe. And I said there are problems with this. One of the problems is that not everything affects everything else. And yes, drinking water might change some of your cells or your intestines irreversibly, but your cells and your intestines are parts of you. They're not you, right? You can lose cells and still be yourself. You can lose part of your intestines and still be yourself. You could possibly lose all your memories and still be yourself, right? I mean, we might say figuratively that my grandfather is no longer my grandfather because of Alzheimer's. He doesn't remember me. In some sense, it's still your grandfather. And so, yeah, you can have debates on those points. But to say that the fact that there are debates means that the debates are merely subjective, I don't think does justice, because you're going to be arguing about the changes and which changes are important and which aren't. And so what I was looking at in the case of the Dutch East India Company are things that actually changed the company irreversibly, as opposed to things that changed some of its ships irreversibly or changed its exact geographical scope irreversibly. And so you just have to do the work of looking and seeing which things happened that absolutely changed how the company is structured, how it works. There were a couple of geographical ones. That person, Kern, was the only human individual who played a role. There were a couple of geographical locations that once the company captured them, it changed the nature of the company's trade. One of them allowed it to link the old Chinese and Arab trade routes. So it very much changed the nature of the kind of business that was being done. There was another point at which they realized, why are we doing all these round trips back to Amsterdam that take forever? Why don't we just focus on intra-Asian trade? And so they started going to smaller ships, starting by capturing Asian ships and then building their own small ships, because all these Asian river ports are shallow and can't take the big back and forth to Europe ships. And no, there's no foolproof way. What OOO does is offers certain tools that are different from the past for weighing which things are irreversible and which ones are not. But the reason the things with your cells and your intestines are not irreversible changes is because they are irreversible changes to those parts, not to you. Sorry about the Lyme disease. A lot of people have health versions of that. For me, it was going to Egypt. I am not the same person that I was before Egypt. And that's interesting because it's asymmetrical. Egypt is very much the same place before I came there, right? Egypt's been there for thousands of years. I'm sure I affected it not at all, except in some trivial economic sense. But it plays a huge part in my life. So I think in each of our lives, there's maybe only a half dozen or so things that merit that status, even though there are lots of incidents in all of our lives. You know, I was mugged once in Chicago, but that's not something that changed me irreversibly. It could have if they'd shot me or something, left me with paralyzed or something. But it turned out to just be a regrettable incident that I tell people about sometimes. COVID, for some people, is that. For others, it changes them irreversibly. They either die or they get long COVID. So different events can mean different things for different people. And I don't think it's an accident that things that happen when we're young tend to affect us more. Because that's a time when you're unusually receptive to outside influences. Well, I still get excited about new authors that I discover, but not in the way that I did when I was 22 or 23. You know, the people who influenced you when you're young are the people who really influenced you, and they never go away. But you know, I just read Sloterdijk's whole Spheres trilogy for the first time, and I'm too old for Sloterdijk to leave a big impact on me. I'm able to go through now and read it dispassionately and say, I like this part of it, I don't like this part of it. He's just another author to me now. But I'm sure there's some 21-year-old somewhere whose worldview is being distinctively shaped by Sloterdijk. Things like that happen.
Yeah. No, I've never been called close to Bruno Latour before, so that I take that as a real insult. But I think that I think that, I mean, I don't have a problem with any of your analyses, frankly. Like that seems fine to me, and I agree actually that there are obviously there, and this is where I think maybe we both agree about this, that Du's notion of event is important. Like that there are these like epochal moments that change things, and then everything else, it's just kind of situational change. It's not really what's fundamental. That's fine. I think that's fine. I mean, I'm laicizing his notion of event because obviously he wouldn't see it working on that kind of level. But so that seems fine to me. But again, I think like what I guess what I don't want to just keep going around in a circle because I'm just going to keep saying like there's a and when you said merely subjectivity like that, I would never say that. Like I think like the fact that it is that subjectivity plays a role in what we deem to be important is part of what's important. And I think it seems to me like the way in which things, I guess let me just turn, because I feel like I'm just going to repeat things that I said before, but let me just kind of turn it. So I guess my question is in what sense can you say, and I wonder what you think about this, that in what sense can you say that the object is, or what grants you the theoretical ground to say the object is isolated, right? That objects are isolated. Because you say this, I think almost in every book that I've read of yours, even maybe not in Art and Objects, because that's a little different, but in almost all the other books, I think you say that that objects withdraw from other objects, right? It seems to me like it's much more evident of the opposite, right? That objects actually reach out to other objects, are affected by other objects, encounter other objects all the time, right? Like the squirrel just went up the tree, the rain hits the tree, all these things are happening all the time. So, and this strikes me as it seems to me there's I don't know, unconscious hostility to dialectical interaction within OOO. And I think and I also think you have this amazing statement. You say, I just wanted to get your responses. This is your own statement. I'm going to read back to you. Radical politics, as we know it, is an outgrowth of modern philosophy with its modern idealism, and hence is unlikely to survive much longer than modern philosophy itself. And okay, obviously I don't agree with that. But what strikes me is that there's this idea of the object being isolated is, I think you can say that about modern radical politics because your position is a liberal position that takes every object and every person as isolated, right? And I think that is a failure to see the way in which they're all the time reaching out into each other. I do want to say one last thing, that it's funny that you didn't, and I think this is a great tribute to you, that you didn't, your being mugged did not turn you, because you know this line, what's a conservative? It's a liberal who's been mugged, right? And so it didn't turn you into a conservative. So that's a tribute to you that it was not an event in your life. But okay, I think you're a real convinced liberal. And I think it's because of this notion of the isolation of the object and not the necessary interaction. So.
All right, maybe I'll start with the politics first, and then I'll get back to the Civil War. Liberalism for me is kind of like Descartes' provisional ethical code, right? It seems like I understand the arguments against liberalism, that it excretes its waste in the colonies, and it requires a global system where the center siphons everything from the periphery. I get all of that, and I get the critiques of American imperialism and so forth. But liberalism also has its moments, and I think Ukraine is one of them. That Ukraine is simply a case where we need to stand up for the Ukrainians. They're being brutalized by basically a dictator. Putin's not a good guy. And I'm not going to say that NATO is completely innocent, because I think NATO probably expanded beyond where they should have, but I think Putin has destroyed that argument with his behavior. And I think now we just need to help Ukraine win. Even though I have many Russian friends, I think Putin needs to go, and hope he will. But and then the left will often say liberals obsess over too much, like racism and sexism. The real crime is the economic foundations that make racism and sexism possible. I'm not sure I believe that economic conditions are the only things that make racism and sexism possible. I think racism, especially in the United States, is a cancerous independent entity that doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with economics. Now, here's my problem with modern political theory, and this applies to the right and to the center as much as it does to the left. The case I've made is that, okay, the left goes back to the French Revolution, the two sides of the assembly in the French Revolution. Ultimately, the left and the right come down to theories of human nature. Is it that humans are nice and kind and cooperating like nature, as Rousseau thinks, so that society exploits us and makes us unequal, which is also Marx's position, roughly? Or is it that humans are so awful that the only hope we have is to use brute force to make sure they behave, which is the position of Hobbes, Machiavelli, Schmitt, people like that, a good or bad anthropology of humans. Now, it's interesting that David Graeber and David Wengrow's celebrated new book, The Dawn of Everything, which I'm in the middle of reading right now, agrees with me about that they agree with me that the deadlock in political theory comes from the deadlock between Rousseau and Hobbes, as those are the only two options. The solution that Graeber and Wengrow give in order to innovate is to say, actually, humans aren't naturally good or naturally evil. Humans produce themselves. Humans are creative. Humans can invent new possibilities. Okay, great. That's refreshing by comparison with the other theories, I admit. And it allows them to bring all kinds of new stuff into their political theory. But it still puts humans at the center. Now, what's the problem with that? Aren't humans the political animal? Yes. Politics is the creation of humans, and it's not political if there aren't humans involved. I wouldn't say that any animals have politics. But there is a huge amount of inanimate participation in politics. And this has probably been best described by Bruno Latour with Shirley Strum, the primatologist he worked with early, where they studied baboons in the fields and realized that baboons are a lot more social than we are. But baboons are a lot more interrelated with each other than we are. They're constantly watching each other, making sure the pack doesn't go too far away from them, trying to see which gorillas are mating with or feeding, or baboons are mating with or massaging or feeding other baboons today. Their entire life is a social life. They're totally wrapped up in the society of the baboons. With humans, we have a little more insulation from that. So Latour jokes that when I go to the post office to buy some stamps, thank God the postal worker does not start telling me about his girlfriend's beautiful teeth, right? I walk around with a wedding ring on. I walk around with an ID card. When I wake up in the morning, except in times of crisis, I know pretty much who I am. I'm a philosophy professor at Southern California Institute of Architecture. I know what my salary check is going to be at the end of the month. I know Los Angeles is probably not going to be bombed, right? Maybe it could be in the future, but I wake up thinking in the back of my mind, there could be a huge earthquake, but we're probably not going to be bombed by Putin, right? So there are certain things I can take for granted because there are inanimate objects such as treaties, wedding certificates, wedding rings, bank accounts, ID cards, locked front doors on apartments that give me some sense of not having to interact with stuff, creating my own private space. This is what Sloterdijk talks about, by the way, when he talks about spheres, things that are disconnected. And incidentally, he talks about how the mother-child sphere is the primordial one for humans, which I think is fascinating. The child-mother relationship is fundamental to philosophy. I'd never thought of that. But also, this has been seen primarily, clearly, not only by Latour and others who view inanimate objects as part of politics, but also by the geographical interpretation of history, which sometimes is too deterministic. But there are reasons why certain countries tend to fight wars against each other over and over again, right? Because they're competing for the same resources. There are reasons why certain countries don't fight ever in history, even if they're next to each other. There are all sorts of factors that are geographical in nature that have nothing to do with human choice that help shape our political theory. And it's not necessarily determination because certain objects provide leeway to make a choice one direction or another. Look at how smartphones and social media change politics. That wasn't the result of a human decision. That was the result of unanticipated effects from the iPhone. The fact that Ubers were putting taxis out of business for a while until we all realized Ubers are turning into a ripoff, started using taxis again, at least some of us. So inanimate objects play a huge role. And I think modern political theory needs to be revised in such a way to put objects more at the center of it. As for the Civil War, what did I want to say about that? What OOO allowed me to do in the case of the Civil War, as well as in the case of the Dutch East India Company, is not to be too distracted by news. There's a guy that was a philosophy major at DePaul way before my time who became the world's richest futures trader eventually. His name is Richard Dennis. And I remember reading his list of tips about trading. And one of them was do not overreact to news. The other, incidentally, was try to go in the opposite direction other people are going on the market. Very interesting. But I try to not overreact to news when I'm reading history. So in other words, first of all, I wouldn't overreact to the Battle of Shiloh, which I would naturally do because my great-great-grandfather fought there and was wounded. So I have some familiar pride in the Battle of Shiloh that my great-great-grandfather was fighting on the north side, the right side of that war. I should ignore that because it has nothing to do with my family's significance. I can ignore, I didn't include Gettysburg as one of the symbioses, for example, even though it was the bloodiest battle in terms of total casualties, even though it took 3 days. If the North had lost, it could have been a very important event. I don't list Gettysburg as one of my 5 most important. I picked Grant and I picked Lee because both armies were kind of lost until they eventually worked their way to their eventual top commander, both North and South. The North took a little longer to find Grant. Vicksburg, because it closed the Western theater more or less, and it became only an Eastern war. Chattanooga, because that's the point at which Grant was called back east after winning at Chattanooga by accident. Sherman was put in charge of the West and eventually burned Atlanta and allowed Lincoln to win again. And then I think the 5th one I had was the Emancipation Proclamation. When I went to visit Antietam, the Ranger was making the case that that was the most important battle of the Civil War. It was the bloodiest one-day battle in American history, but that wouldn't be why it's the most important. It's the most important because Lincoln was waiting for a victory or at least a tie to implement the Emancipation Proclamation. So it looked like he was doing it out of strength rather than weakness, which was the first step towards freeing the slaves, because he said all slaves still owned by rebelling states are freed, not that all slaves are freed. So the slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland were still slaves, but it was a big first step. And I would say about extending it from the Missouri Compromise until the 1964, you could make that case. The reason I would find that a little far-fetched is that you had a kind of period where the war was ended during Reconstruction, at least until Reconstruction ended, when the Klan came back in and the black senators were chased out and the black property owners lost their property again. And so you had kind of a second period of Jim Crow and the re-rise of the Klan. And I'd call that the battle for civil rights or something, right? From the late 70s up through mid 1960s. And in a sense, it's not over now. I would interpret Trumpism as a revanchism of the pro-segregationists, the anti-civil rights people. I think a lot of Republican Party rhetoric since the 60s has been coded racist rhetoric. I can see a lot more of that in Reagan now than I saw at the time. I was too young to see that at the time, but in Trump, it just became a bullhorn. Mm-hmm. And voting rights stuff going on now, the same thing. So the point is not that racism ever ended in the US. The point is that slavery ended. And I would say the Civil War ended, even though successor entities came after the Civil War that borrow some features from it, but are not still the Civil War, I would say. But somebody, even from a OOO standpoint, could disagree with me. And I have no way to say, no, you're wrong. I could just point to the evidence and we could debate the evidence. But if the person were also OOO, we'd be using the same standards and same criteria. We would just be disagreeing with how to apply them. And I'm not sure that ever stops. Just go and look at how many people have contradicted Freud on certain points. Lacan contradicts Freud constantly, despite his admiration for him, in fascinating ways. And actually, Todd, I was going to ask you about Lacan here. Yeah. How much of your Hegel is actually a retroactively Lacanized Hegel? Because I like what you say about absolute knowing having some contingency in it, and it's never going to be ideal. But that sounds almost more like Lacan to me. That Lacan is the person who doesn't really have absolute knowing in the traditional Hegelian sense.
Right, but doesn't, I mean, I actually would say it's the other way around, that my Lacan is a Hegelianized Lacan, not because I think that I just take the line from the chapter on absolute knowing that spirit knows both itself and its limit, right? And so then he has this great line: to know one's limit is to know how to sacrifice oneself. So there's this real sense, I think, of knowing that spirit comes to know, or subjectivity comes to know its inability to know everything, right? So I think and I think Lacan is a terrible reader of Hegel. So I think that part of it is trying to inform it the other way around. I just want to touch. I was fascinated by what you said about left and right, and I know that I don't disagree about the Civil War. I was just giving a hypothetical, right? So I agree with your point. But I think this interesting Rousseau-Hobbes kind of thing. And by the way, there's a really good book by Marcel Gauchet about the right-left distinction, and he makes the point that we all say it goes back to the Assembly, the National Convention, or whatever. But in fact, like they never used that, or they used it once or something. And it's like this I like this idea that it's this retroactive thing that subsequent thinkers link to the French Revolution, when in fact, his point, I love this idea that verticality was much more important for them than horizontally, like the mountain was more. So anyway, but
what's the title of Gaucher's book?
it's called Gaucher Droite or something like that. I'll send it to you. Yeah.
Okay. And it's French only, right?
It's only in French, yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, but I think my critique of Marx would be the opposite. Like, I think that Marx is much too Hobbesian. Like, he thinks that we really act out of our self-interest, and that's why there'll be an eventual proletarian revolution. But I think, why hasn't there been one? Why haven't people revolted? Well, it's because it's very hard to get people to act out of their self-interest, I would say. And I think to me, that's the problem with the Graeber book as well, that there's a sense of, even though I have a lot of respect for both of them, I think there's still a kind of sense of that people are going to act in their best interest. And I guess, like, whereas you want to emphasize the importance of objects in what we do, what I see is vital is to see the importance of our unconscious destructiveness, right? Our unconscious self-destructiveness, so that we're not at all, I don't think we're at all self-interested beings. And I think the mistake of the left has actually been to think that we're self-interested. And I think the right understands the way in which we're not. Think of all these people that are voting for Trump it's like destroying their self-interest, right? But they do it not only willingly, but with absolute glee, right? So, and like this guy that just won the primary last night in Ohio, J.D. Vance, like all the people that vote, all these rural counties where they're like, they don't have two nickels to rub together. And they're going, you brought up pride in your family. I'll bring up shame in my family. Those are all my relatives that are voting for him. So that to me is the thing, right? So it's interesting. I mean, I would be fascinated if someone could connect those two ideas, like the importance of the object and then our drive to not be self-interested. Because I think maybe somewhere there's a connection, although we've already talked for 2 hours, so we're probably not going to come to it. But I think that I find that a kind of interesting potential conjunction, right? So I don't know.
I should have guessed from the Cincinnati Bengals shirt that there was an Ohio connection.
Yeah, and a really let me just so my uncle, his family, they had a trailer by the Ohio River, and when the river overflowed, they'd move their trailer in. So they were not exactly the upper crust of Ohio, but anyway.
Sounds a little like Ozark, huh?
Yeah, it's a little like, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, that's very can I just interrupt? Sorry. So yeah, we have been going for nearly 2 hours, so I don't know how much longer you guys want to go, but I know we're on the topic of politics now, but Graham, if you want to make this your closing statement, you can, or you can respond to that. We can just you can just see how it goes, but we have been going for a while now.
I'll just close by responding to Todd's point.
Sure.
Of course, I completely agree that psychoanalysis has opened up that new dimension of people not acting in their own interests. And my outside reading right now, which I'm going to finish after this, is Etienne Gilson's The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy. And it fascinated me because he's talking about how the medieval scholastics obviously took Plato and Aristotle as their foundation, especially Aristotle, but brought in certain content of revelation that can't be justified rationally on philosophical grounds, but that helped transform the philosophy. Certain assumptions they made about God, God's goodness, God's infinity, Christ as the savior, allowed them, even if you think it's totally wrong, it allowed them to do very interesting things with Plato and Aristotle. And I want to poke around here. If you're going to shudder if I claim that Lacan is like a revelation, I know, but structurally it works the same way. Right? That Lacan revealed certain things that were simply not on Hegel's horizon anywhere unless you want to say that Hegel was such a genius that he kind of had a presentiment of some of them. This Lacanized Hegel that we see in the Ljubljana school has that aspect too, right? That they're, in a way, they're bringing the revelations of psychoanalysis to bear on German idealism. And you've already said that you try to Hegelize Lacan instead, but is it really possible to Hegelize Lacan without Lacanizing Hegel? Because of the statement you just made. Our working against our self-interest, well, if the idea of everyone being self-interested is in Marx, it's probably in Hegel because it comes from liberal English economics, I assume. The idea that the invisible hand of Smith or Mandeville's fable of the bees, that everyone by working selfishly for their own interests leads to the common good. I can't say what amount of that is in Hegel. You can probably tell me, but don't you need something beyond Hegel to get the insight you just gave?
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Graham. I appreciate that, because I think that there is no concept of the unconscious or of death. What I've been talking about is a death drive. There's none of that in Hegel. That Hegel still has in fact, this was a source of a little disagreement. We don't have that many between Slavoj and I over like Hegel still invoking the good. And I was like, this is a limit in Hegel. And Slavoj just refused to accept that that was a limit in Hegel. So I do think you're right that Hegel, I mean, I think it comes down to this, that whole tradition of English philosophers and Hegel and Marx think that we are pursuing the good. And I think the fundamental, to me, idea of psychoanalysis is that that the good is an alibi for what we're really pursuing. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
I agree that psychoanalysis adds something so fundamental that philosophy should not be the same after psychoanalysis. It's something I totally agree with the Ljubljana circle about.
I also like this idea, if I could just say, Graham, I like this idea of revelation. Like, I'm totally for that. So you thought I would object to that. I'm not objecting. I love that idea. So yeah.
Okay, well, all right. Seems like we're getting kind of to near the end here. So do you guys want to like close like an actual closing statement, as in like summarizing like what you've taken from this and like summarizing your position, maybe just for the audience, because we've touched on a lot of different things and I've been able to follow along just because I'm aware of both of your work and stuff. But maybe if you guys want to close just with like, what's your position, why you disagree with the other, and why or like what, if you've learned anything new or anything else you want to add now that we've had the 2 hours of discussion. So Dr. Harman, if you want to start. Yeah.
Sure. For me, this felt like about 5 minutes. I could keep this going all day, except that I have other stuff I've committed to. I haven't eaten breakfast yet either. It's still only 11 o'clock out here in LA in the morning. Anytime you have a conversation based on goodwill like this one, you learn something. Because we have different experiences, all of us. We have different reading backgrounds. We have different ideas. I think the issue where Todd and I may disagree most is the idea about objects always being in relation. And of course, I see why he says that. My counter response would be this. I teach at an architecture school, and even among artists, you often hear this is a site-specific work. It can't just be picked up and moved into different galleries like traditional paint. It's site-specific. And of course, architects do that even more because architects totally have to build for the site they're building on. And I hear this all the time in student reviews. This is a site-specific building. My response to that is any site has an infinite amount of information, an infinite number of features. When you're making a site-specific work, you're choosing to interact with a few of them. And you're making a conscious decision not to interact with all aspects of the site because it's literally impossible to interact with all aspects of the site. And so even if you think you're putting an object beyond itself by putting it into relations with things, you are creating a kind of sphere, as Sloterdijk would say. You're creating a limited number of relations of things together that are forming an enclosure that influence each other. And of course, that can change. You can always start relating to something else. But just consider how many people you've walked past in your life or driven past, millions. How many people do you actually know in any real sense? Sociologists, I think, say 400 or 500, and that's why you shouldn't go above 400 or 500 Facebook friends, because beyond that, it's not true. They aren't people you know. So this infinity that we think exists in our lives doesn't. There's a limited number of things to which we relate. there are a lot of things to which we relate that don't really leave any impact on us, even if they leave impact on our bodies or parts of our bodies. So I've had a couple of sunburns in the last month, and I suppose those could be symbiotic if I end up getting melanoma or something at some point from that. But assuming I don't, it was a painful sunburn for a couple of weeks. It wasn't a major influence in my life. I had heart surgery in March, and that probably wasn't a major impact on my life. It was a fairly routine procedure involving a catheter. It wasn't open heart surgery, and it went successfully, luckily. It could have ruined my life if it had gone badly, but it didn't. And so you can't really say that was one of the key events in my life. It was a medical problem I had to take care of, and now they say it's over. Let's see. But so for me, the number of relations a thing is in, while potentially infinite, is actually always quite limited. Sloterdijk also, I'm just mentioning Sloterdijk a lot because I just happen to have read the whole Spheres trilogy over the last month or so. He talks also a lot about how we imagine ourselves as these wildly social creatures. But if you're in a couple, most of your time is spent at home, just you and your partner. It's amazing how much that happens. It's the two of you a lot of times. Some couples are more social than others. So it's not like we are in all these relations that we think we are in. We kind of come up for air every once in a while into this broader network of relations or do something new. But we are creatures of habits, and we are creatures of a fairly limited circle of objects, even if we don't realize it. So the way of saying it is that OOO's anti-holism, not because nothing relates to anything, but because nothing relates to everything, right? There's always a limit to relations. There's always an outer limit of the number of relations a thing is in. And of those relations, only a small number are really affected, although many of those relations can affect your cells or your intestines, as Todd said. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Thanks, Graham. I really, really appreciate the discussion too. And I too felt like it flew by and would love to continue if it were not for other obligations, although I've already had breakfast because it's, what is it, 2:00 here. So I want to speak to two things, and I got a lot out of it too, but I want to say that I do think that everything relates to everything. So that'll be a good point of difference. And I think that it does because nothing relates fully to itself. So that's this non-self identity of things is really important for me. But I actually want to end on a point where you're going to think this is ironic that I agree with you, that I actually think that there is part that the object is part of it does get elevated outside of all of its relations. And that's actually the part of the object that is what that aspect of the object, or that objectness, is what appeals to us in the object. And that's what we're taken by in the object. And the only difference is, I wouldn't say that that's what makes us finite. I would say that's what makes us infinite. That's our ability to like cut out something of the world and say, this is what counts and nothing else counts. That's our infinitude. Like your example of the person home with their partner, like this person counts. I don't care about the rest of the world. That's, to me, not our finitude. That's our infinitude. And that's why I'm not Heideggerian and probably not in agreement with you. But I do like this idea of like picking out the one and sort of at the expense of all the rest. I think that's the best thing that we do. So.
Okay, well, I think it's about time to wrap up. Thank you to everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. And yeah, thanks to both of you for this fantastic discussion.